Hey guys, thanks for joining me. So, as always, just want to start off with a huge thank you to everyone who has been liking, sharing, and watching. Um, Hoping with today's case that it's one that you guys are not that familiar with. If you are, then and you feel that I've missed anything out, then please leave a comment down below. If you are new here and you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that notification bell. I will never ask you guys for money, as I've always stated, but a subscription is always free. So, with today's case, just want to clarify a few things before I get into the story. So, some of the names in the story, they have been changed for legal reasons. Um, I'm going to try my best to pronounce these names because the story that we're going to be talking about is from China, and sometimes, because of obviously the way they're spelled, you're not sure how to pronounce them, and that's. But I'm going to try my best to do it for you guys. If you feel that I've got any wrong, just add a comment down below. Just say, "Oh, it's pronounced like this." I always read your comments, always reply, so please keep them coming. If you don't know this story, just obviously feel free to comment whatever you like. It's going to be a bit of a shocker. Now, I just want to also clarify that, as I stated last week, I am currently in the process of doing some residency gigs in a local pub, um, which means obviously time restraints are a little bit lower at the moment. So these stories are going to be a bit shorter, but I'm going to try my best to keep doing this for you guys because I really appreciate the support that you've given me over the past 9 months. So with all that said and done, all the thank yous out of the way, let's get into today's story. So, the story today revolves around a man called Lee Ho. So Lee, he was born in 1977. And what I do know is that he has one sister, but I couldn't find any information about his background, what he went through when he was a child to lead him to be the man that he was. He was born in Henan, China. Now, at the time of his arrest, what I do know is that he was in a long-term marriage to a 24-year-old woman. So at the time of his arrest, he was about 10 years older than this woman. And the couple had an 8-month-old son. Now, initially, Lee, he worked as a firefighter, and that was for Luyong City Fire Bureau. And then he changed a career path to start working at a technology bureau in Henan. Now, according to his wife, she basically had no idea of his crimes. He basically had lied to her, saying that he also had a night job in the city, and he basically did this night job for 2 weeks each month. So in reality, obviously, he used those 2 weeks to carry out his depraved crimes, but to her, she just assumed that he was at work. This is what he was telling her. So, in August of 2009, so Lee purchases a residential compound in Saigon, where he basically spends another year digging out a dungeon and designing a dungeon. And this was described by officers as a fortified underground cellar and a subterranean prison. Now, this dungeon, it was built under the compound by a connecting tunnel. The entrance to this tunnel and the whole entire thing, it was around 60 centimetres wide. So you're thinking about obviously two standard sized rulers put together, not very big at all. It could only be accessed by the person crawling through the space. Now, once you got through this tunnel and got into the actual dungeon itself, it was separated with 2 bedrooms. So, and then there was like a couple of beds that were in there, and this was around 4 meters underground. And throughout the tunnel, Lee had placed a series of metal airtight doors. That obviously was to prevent any sort of escaping and also any noises that were going to happen. So the whole entire dungeon, including the tunnel, it was measured to be around 215 square meters. So not an overly massive space considering, but considering what he goes on to do with this. But Lee's intention was to hold captives under here, and his idea was that he was going to earn money from them by pimping them out. He was going to direct his own pornography films and sell them to the highest bidder. So he puts in some computers in the dungeon, and these computers were very basic. You know, they didn't have, obviously, understandably, he prohibited any access to the internet, but these were for his captives to watch films, play games. He would deny the captives of any food, so he would had the plan of feeding them every 2 days. By his reckoning of doing this, the captives would be too weak for them to fight back against him and completely be under his control. The only time that the captives were allowed to leave the dungeon was when basically he needed to make money, so it was all at his disposal. So he would force them into sex work by bringing other men into the dungeon to rape them. Because let's not forget, obviously, these captives, they would have no say in this. They are being held against their will, and majority of them wouldn't want to turn to sex work if they could help it. So obviously, when I was reading this case, a lot of it was sounding like they were willing participants. And don't get me wrong, like obviously some of the stuff that they do, it comes a bit clearer as I go on with this story. They're not. Some of the stuff they go on to do is reprehensible within itself, but let's not forget the mastermind behind all this. So within the dungeon as well, there was no toilet facilities. There was no wash facilities. There was nothing, like no open sewage. So the captives, they were basically forced to defecate and urinate within the rooms, and these were the rooms that they were to sleep and eat in. So the entire space, it was described as really dank and smelly. I mean, you can imagine, obviously, being underground, there's no proper ventilation. And it was reported that the captives, they really competed for Lee's attention, and they were later described with Stockholm Syndrome. Now, if you're not familiar with what Stockholm Syndrome is, it comes from a case in Stockholm. And this was where 2 men held up a bank. And from my belief of this, I haven't read it up in a while, but my belief of this is that the captives that were being held at gunpoint, they began feeling really sorry for the men that were robbing the bank, and this is where the term Stockholm Syndrome comes from. So obviously back to the story about Lee. So within a 2-year time frame, so between 2009 and 2011, Lee, he was going to karaoke bars, other nightclubs, and he propositioned 6 bar workers by promising money if they come back to his house and have sex with him. He would then coerce these women, blackmail them, and use violence against them to imprison them in the cellar. So this all began in October of 2009. He meets Jean Chouchan. I apologise if I butchered that name. But like I said, obviously, these are not the women's real names. They've been protected in the media. They've been protected in the court documents. So, she's the first victim that he coerces into this. He forces her, obviously, into the cellar. Feeds her every 2 days. He subjects her to multiple rapes, beatings, and then 2 months later, he takes 18-year-old Joanne Mumu. Now, Joanne, she too, her identity is protected. She joins in, and they're both subjected to this treatment. And this goes on for about a year, so the two women are just basically stuck down in the cellar for about a year. In December of 2010, he then goes back to the same bar, and he coerces 19-year-old Jian Mumu to come back with him. So again, she's got a protected identity as well. So she joins the other two women in the cellar. March 2011, he coerces a 20-year-old Jean Mumu. In May, he kidnaps a 16-year-old Kai Mumu. And in July of 2011, his sixth and final victim is 23-year-old Ma Mumu. So, obviously Lee, again, he's now got 6 women in the cellar. He's feeding them every 2 days. He's subjecting them to rapes, beatings. They're being told that they need to work as sex workers for him to facilitate his lifestyle. He forces them to perform real degrading sexual acts upon each other. And whilst they are doing this, Lee's filming this. He starts selling this online on a website called 10 Cent QC, and he was selling 30-minute videos for around 30 yuan, which works out to about £5.40. And hour-long videos were for 100 yuan, which is over £10.80. And Lee filmed and sold around 50 of these videos. He was using an app called Alipay to collect his earnings, so very similar to what PayPal would be. And these assaults caused 20-year-old Jean Mumu to fall pregnant. Now, I couldn't find any other information about this. I couldn't find if she actually went on to have the baby. All I know is that at some point she falls pregnant. It doesn't say who by, whether it was Lee or one of the clients that was raping her. So in July of 2010, the first victim, Jean Chouchan, she sees an opportunity to escape, and this is while Lee's just carrying out some maintenance work on the dungeon. So he's got his back to her. He's got the doors open. She sees an escape attempt, and she hits him on the back of the head. Now you can imagine, obviously, she's been in there for quite some time now. She's probably incredibly weak. So he's able to overpower her, and he beats her into submission. He handcuffs her to a bed, and eventually she's released from these restraints. In August of that year, she attempts a second escape attempt. She does the exact same thing. So he's carrying out maintenance work. She hits him. And he basically decides enough is enough. He's going to kill her. So he's starts beating her, but she's fighting the courage. She's really fighting back for her life. She knows what's going to happen. And Lee coerces Joanne to help kill her. And for some weird reason, Joanne, she complies. And the two subject Jan to a real severe beating. And then they both strangle her to death. And all of this was done because Lee promised Joanne that he would let her go free. Obviously, he doesn't. So she's thinking that she has no choice. It's her freedom. She wants to get out of this situation, understandably. And it doesn't matter if this woman has kept her company. She's got to die for Joanne to get the freedom that she wants, get back to her family. So Lee, with now Sean being dead, he goes about digging a pit under the beds. He buries Shan in this pit, and this is basically his way of warning the other five to obey him, to not fight back, to not try and escape. In May 2011, 16-year-old Kai, so she was found to have a gynecological disease, and this basically meant that she wasn't able to act out the depraved acts on film for him to sell. She wasn't able to essentially be raped by the people that were paying to rape her. And Lee just basically saw her as useless, and he tells the others that he's going to kill Kai. He coerces them into beating Kai on a daily basis. He denies Kai any food, apart from forcing her to eat the feces and drink urine of the other women. And in July 2007, Lee and the other women, they beat Kai for the final time. They beat her to death. She initially survives the attack, but eventually she dies later that night from her injuries. And he buries her in a concrete pool in the dungeon. So again, this is another warning. So within a time frame of between August to September of 2011, Lee, he once again forces the surviving women to have sex for money, sex with other men for money, and this is on quite a few numerous occasions. So this was at a hotel, and also there was a lottery shop that was right opposite the hotel in Saigon. So the women, obviously, they're allowed out of the cellar to visit these places. And it's believed that Lee profited around 700 yuan. So this worked out to excuse me. So this worked out to about £50, I believe. Now, on September the 2nd, 2011, this proved to be Lee's day of reckoning. So he takes 3 of the women to go back to the hotel and the lottery shop. He leaves Jian in the cellar, sorry. And in the early hours of September the 3rd, Ma, one of the women he's taken out to be used as a sex worker, she basically manages to make an escape, and she's really successful in this. She manages to run down the street, she manages to make contact with the police, she tells the police everything that's gone on, and Lee obviously finds out. He knows it's only a matter of time before the police come looking for him, so he goes on the run. And this is with help from his sister, which we're going to get to in a bit. Now, with cooperation from Ma, Xian, she was basically finally freed from the cellar. So she goes with the police back to the home so they can investigate. She tells them there's still someone in the dungeon. So now two of them free. And then eventually the other two women, they are rescued from the hotel and the lottery shop. Now, Li Hao, he basically spends the next couple of days on the run. The four women are held in protective custody. They basically tell the police everything about what they've been through, about the beatings. They even go as far as telling them about the other two, so Kai and Jan. So Lee, he eventually arrives at his sister's house, and he asks to basically borrow money. So his sister, her name was Li Yuan, she gives her brother a 1,000 yuan, as that equals to about £108. So she gives him this, and she believes it's going to help him. But he's eventually arrested on September the 6th for his crimes, finally. And his sister, she's also arrested. So obviously she's arrested for aiding and abetting a criminal. And soon the media, they begin developing a real deep interest in this case. So they hear about it through the grapevine, which we're going to get back to in a little bit. And eventually, after a little while, they're given the basic information of the case to report on. And eventually, this starts going overseas because obviously, this is a really severe crime, naturally. And yeah, people are going to be interested, but their first and foremost concern, which we're going to get to on as well, it's not to do with the safety of the victims, it's about reputation. That's all the Chinese government and officials they were concerned about in regards to this story, which, like I said, we're going to get to in a bit. So obviously the police, they had to examine the dungeon and they find the bodies of Shan and Kai. So with this evidence, Lee, he's charged with multiple counts of rape, prostitution, illegal distribution of pornography, and illegal detention, along with the 2 counts of murder. These 4 surviving women, they were also charged with murdering Shan and Kai. Now, the trial begins in 2012 with Lee eventually being found guilty of all the charges, and this was by the People's Court of Wuhan. He's deprived of any political rights, so he's deprived of the rights of having an attorney come and represent him. He's fined 10,000 yuan, so around £1,084, and he's eventually expelled from any public and party offences. On November the 30th of that year, so 35-year-old Lee, he's eventually sentenced to death, and this is eventually approved and upheld by the Supreme People's Court. These 4 surviving women, they were then charged with the murders of Shan and Kai, but because of their own ordeals, it was given more leniency. Basically, their lawyer fought hard for the judge to show them a bit of mercy because of their own ordeals and what they had been through. They still had to be faced punishment for their crime, of course they did, but I can see that point. Like, obviously, they had been through an horrendous time themselves. What I don't understand is why only 3 of them were given probation orders, but Joanne, she was seen as the worst of the women. She was given a 3-year prison sentence. So they were represented by a lady called Zhang Ya. So she was a lawyer from Shanghai, and Zhang said that whilst Lee's death sentence was really predictable, she had to lobby hard for the leniency to be held on the women. She said that without Lee's control and Lee's coercion, they wouldn't have done what they had done. She was the one that basically said that they were suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. So after the sentences were passed, a man called Zhuo Congguin, so he is the director of public security in Luoyang. He said that the time between Lee abducting the 6 women and being apprehended, it took way too long. Like, someone should have acted after the first woman was abducted, maybe the second woman, but he basically just says it's taken way too long. He basically says that the local police station were ineffective and an investigation was launched. And 4 of the officers that were initially involved in the case, they end up being suspended from duty. Now, I couldn't find if they had been reinstated whatsoever. I can only assume that they have been. It's very rare that things like this end up in a dismissal. So Guo, he basically requests that entertainment areas such as clubs, bars and things like that, he basically says to them, you need to be more vigilant with your bar staff. Anyone who's seen as vulnerable, you need to do thorough inspections. He orders an intense cleaning of the internet, and this is for any indecent material. Now, whilst that's all good and done, whilst that's all good to say, policing the internet is going to be a real difficult task, because I've already said this before on a previous video. You probably, if you watch other true crime channels, they probably say the same thing. The website that we see, the internet that we see, they believe it only accumulates for around 5% of that. The whole lot of that is the dark web, and then the deep dark web. And these people think they're clever. Like, obviously they have routers and onion router and things like that, where you have to strip back layers and layers. You need passwords and you need code breaking to get into these websites. And it could take months, it could take years for them to break these codes. And eventually they do. Obviously we see that if you've watched the Peter Scully video. Sorry about that, it's one of the cats. If you watch the Peter Scully video, it's basically what they did to bring him down. The Richard Huckle video as well, the exact same thing that they did to bring him down. And so obviously these things do take a lot of time, I appreciate that, but is it really that effective? Let's be real. So, the reporter who initially requested to make the case public, at first he's denied this and told, like, no, you can't. And he goes ahead and puts out, basically, like, very little information about the case, but he makes the case well known. He puts the case out there. So he's arrested for this. He's arrested for revealing state secrets. Now, he initially had travelled to Luoyang to report on the case of a man called Li Zhan. So Li Shan, he was a journalist in China. He basically reported on news channels in China, like really well known, and he was stabbed to death outside his home on 19th of September 2011. So when the reporter hears about Lee's story, Lee Hao, he's initially prevented as only really a few high officials were aware of this case. And their first concern, as I stated before, their first concern, it was not to do with the safety of the women, it was not to do with what had happened to the women. All it was they wanted to save face. They didn't want people to look down on their city as high of a crime, and where this sort of thing happens too many times, they are concerned that the story will tarnish their reputation, they will lose a lot of trade. The authorities, however, they try and deny that this was the case. They basically say, oh, yeah, well, we never said that. And eventually they allow for the story to be released. Like I said, obviously the story goes worldwide, and soon after it's being reported on Fox News, it's in English newspapers. The resident of the building that was above the dungeon, his name was Cao Yongshu. He described the crimes as unimaginable. I mean, I can only imagine myself that Cal probably moved out as soon as this happened, as soon as this story broke out. I can't imagine anyone would want to stay in that place. So, on January the 21st, 2014, so Lee, he basically spends his final day alive meeting with his relatives, and this was in a detention house. He probably had his last meal, had his last rites, all that, and later on that evening, he's executed as instructed by Chinese law. Now, I did try and find how this was carried out. What I do know is that capital punishment still exists in China. I know there's campaigns at the moment for it to be abolished, but there's still a lot of support out in China for capital punishment to still be a thing. The capital punishment, it basically varies in China. So they've either got lethal injection or dying by firing squad. And this depends on the severity of the cases. With Li Hao, I can only imagine it was by shooting squad because of how severe this case was. But I could be wrong. Like I said, I couldn't find any information on this. All I do know is that he meets his maker on January the 21st, 2014. So, that is all I've got for you guys today. Again, I apologise, it's only a short one. You guys are aware that I have limited access at the moment. Whilst it's really easy for me to get information on British cases, I don't want to stick to just doing British cases. So I do want to try and get information on some overseas cases, and I come across this one and I thought it was too much of an important story for me to not tell. As always, I really appreciate you guys being here. I really appreciate the time that you guys give me. Thank you so much to all of you, each and every one of you. Please keep subscribing. If you come here and you haven't subscribed yet, just hit the bell. I try and post every Friday. Please leave a like, please share, and please comment. Like I said, I always read your guys' comments. So, again, just a huge thank you to you all, and I hopefully will see you very, very soon for the next true crime story with Silhouette. Take care, and I'll see you soon.